I guess you got a little bit of a class on baptism the last couple weeks, which is always good. That's not a problem. I always say I'm a Baptist by choice, so I'm not ashamed to be a Baptist. But that's always good teaching. Now, the assignment for today, does anyone even remember what the assignment was for today? Yeah, okay, so you're supposed to read the book of Proverbs, and you had plenty of opportunity to read it. Randy just ran out in shame. So you might have even had a chance to read it more than once. The goal was to read the book of Proverbs as quickly as you could, move through it, not to get bogged down in details, which you can easily do, but to try to get a flavor of the whole book. So that's what I was after. Now, does anyone want to admit whether or not they made it through the whole book? Right, so there's a few.
You led us to believe it would take 15 to 20 minutes.
I led you to believe that it would take you 15 to 20 minutes. I said you could sit down and possibly do it in one sitting. I didn't say how long it would take before you nodded off. That I have no control over. So that'll be good. So some of you can participate in the conversation today. Others of you might struggle. Okay. So we have two things. So with the fellowship meal, I can't go long today. So we'll try to finish a little early too. But okay. So let's do a little review because it's been a couple weeks, and then we'll get into Proverbs. We will probably be in Proverbs for the next 2 or 3 lessons. I'll say. I won't say weeks. With the situation in Morris, there's a possibility that I'll be missing a couple more Sundays, and we're working through those details. I don't have any details to share. So it's possible that I'll be in and out again here over the next couple of weeks. But just by way of review, so we're talking about Christian worldview, which is where we started. And this is actually from the last time I was here. That's why it says definitions continued, and the font is too small. But our course outline, we talked about introduction and definitions. We'll just review that really quickly. Today we're going to start this section on the fear of the Lord, and then we have knowing God, world order, and imagination, which is the last one. That's where all the excitement is. So the way we do things, the way Pastor and I do things around here, by this time next year, maybe we'll get to that last one. But just kidding. Well, at least be in like Numbers 12 by then in the morning service, but that's all right. All right. So some key terms that we've been talking about. So we're talking about Christian worldview. That's the title of this series. And so what do we mean by worldview in general? And we've actually refined the definition of worldview a little bit, and we will refine it again as we go through the lecture. We'll probably refine it a couple more times. As we learn more, we'll tweak it, as they say. But worldview is all the beliefs that we have that affect how we live in the world. And I said perceived world, but that actually isn't quite accurate either. But it's everything that we believe to be true is our worldview. So it's kind of like all in our mind, so to speak, but it's how we interact with the world around us. So the illustration I used a few weeks ago is, how many of you did a stress test on the chair you're sitting in before you sat in it to make sure that it could, a stress test to make sure it could hold your weight, right? Some of you probably plunked down as hard as you could, figuring if it broke, it needed to be fixed, replaced anyway, kind of thing. But we don't. When you drove here, you assumed certain things about your car and other people's cars around you, and the road and stuff like that. There are things that we assume to be true that allow us to live. The fact that you can see, the fact that you can hear, the fact that you can understand what I'm saying, which in itself is pretty amazing if you think just about our eyes and our ears and how they work. But we don't think about how they work, they just do. And so that's all part of what we do. And so some of those beliefs are theological, like the belief that God exists, the belief that objects don't randomly fall up. Objects might randomly fall down, and the older I get, more of them do randomly fall down, but objects don't usually randomly fall up. The belief that the vast majority of people you meet are not going to harm you. So like I mentioned the cashiers at Hy-Vee, you're not afraid of them, all of them. Maybe there's some that you are afraid of, I don't know. I don't know them that well, but your assumption is that, especially in Southwest Minnesota, your assumption is that people are generally kind and want their own space. So those are assumptions that we make. So worldview is take absolutely everything that you believe to be true, and that's your worldview. Okay, and we don't often think about our worldview until we clash with another culture. We have culture shock. That helps us understand a little bit more about our worldview. So the Christian worldview then is all the Christian beliefs, or all the beliefs that Christians should have about the world. And again, I use the word perceived world here, but that needs to be tweaked. It's what a Christian, how should a Christian view the world? What beliefs should they have? And how do those beliefs instruct the way we interact with the world? And now you can see where Proverbs is coming into the conversation. And we talked about culture and some different definitions of culture and how culture is how a group of people imagine the world should be. And so when you have a group like a church, like us, a gathered group of people, there are certain things that we understand to be the way things should be. And sometimes we think about those things and sometimes we don't. And I've mentioned some of this before, the fact that we have a pulpit that's in the middle of the platform is something that you may not have thought about, but it is something that communicates. Our pastor doesn't turn his back to us and stand between us and God like a priest does. Okay, that's very different. So if you go into a Catholic church, there is an altar, and the priest stands between the people, and he will stand with his back to the people. Of course, that imagery we saw in the Old Testament, but we don't have a priest who stands between us and God. As Pastor taught us this morning, we have direct access to God. We are all priests. But we gather around the Word of God. And so the Word of God is front and center, and we gather around it. We gather around the table, which is why the table ideally would be kind of more out in the middle of us. But the pastor and deacons are behind, so we're all gathered around it because we're all even at this point in time. Nobody is higher than anybody else in the congregation. Even our pastor is one of us when we gather around the table. And so it's important that we have a table that we gather around. Those are all things that represent a Christian ideal and reflects an ideal, I should say. And I would say reflects a Christian ideal. It's the right way to think about certain things. So culture then is it's a manifestation of our worldview, our collective worldview. When culture disintegrates, it means there's a disintegration in the worldview of the people, commonly called fragmentation, but we won't talk about that today. Okay, we talked about that. All right, that was for last time. So, Proverbs. So I'll just stop since we're catching up, but are there any questions about those definitions? Anything that you've thought of over the last few weeks where you're like, I wish I could ask a question? What about? Yes?
Well, I'm kind of curious about fragmentation. I don't know if I've ever heard that term before.
Oh, okay. Yes, so John asked about fragmentation. Without getting too far down that rabbit trail today, all right, so when in a I'll say an ideal situation, even in a church body like this, we're not going to see everything exactly the same way, right? Because we're different people, we've grown up in different circles, we have a different worldview, we have different beliefs in our mind. But when it comes to certain things, we're going to have conversation, we're going to be taught by the Word of God, and we're going to come to an agreement on what should be. So for example, it'd be, like the pulpit. If a pastor came in and said, we think the pulpit should be off to the side because it's not important, well, then that becomes like conflict in worldview. Fragmentation, and the term, you could go to T.S. Eliot, I think probably uses it. You can go to Richard Weaver, uses it. There are others in the art world that use it. But it's the idea that there might be this group of people who have one idea, and then there's this group of people that have an idea, and this group of people have an idea, and all those ideas are competing. So instead of having one unified vision or worldview, it's fragmented. We have 4 or 5, and they aren't just slight differences, but they're actually competing, and they become competing priorities. So what happens in culture then is you have factions, like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 about the Lord's table, the part that Pastor didn't read today in the communion service, that previous paragraph, he says there are factions among you, and I believe it. And the factions in that circumstance around the Lord's table were rich versus poor. And I think that was the situation. I don't think I'm reading any politics into it, but you had these 2 different factions, and that's how we end up seeing the fragmentation of worldview works its way out in a culture where you end up with factions. Our country is very divided today, for example, and so people who study culture would say, well, this is because you have these different competing ideals that are at odds with one another. They can't survive together in unity in any way. Okay, so that's an aside. For those of you who fell asleep, Paul, are you back with me now? Okay, we'll go back to Proverbs. Okay, so Book of Proverbs as a whole. So those of you who did read it, or maybe are still familiar with it, I want to think through a couple of questions about the Book of Proverbs in general. So, and then we'll look at the first few verses, 9 verses, I guess, we'll look at here. But Solomon primarily is the author of Proverbs, okay, of the first 2 main sections of the book. There's other authors that have contributed to it, as we're told in the text, but Solomon is generally the author. But when you read through it, who is the person or the people who are doing the instructing, or doing the teaching? Who are some people that are actually doing the teaching in Proverbs? Parents? Good answer, Olivia. Okay, parents are doing some teaching. Who else? Oh, the fool is doing teaching? Who is the fool teaching?
Some of the Proverbs that talk about the fool, so they're teaching us things.
Oh, so some people can learn from the fool, perhaps what not to do. Okay.
What you just say, Solomon.
Solomon? Yeah, well, Solomon. I was trying to avoid that answer because by my statements that I started with.
Yeah, well, it seems like the most logical answer.
Yes.
Who has wisdom from God until late in his life.
Yes. So obviously Solomon is doing some teaching. in the book of Proverbs. But more generally than Solomon. So we have parents, both mothers and fathers. With,
Just wisdom in general.
yeah, wisdom is teaching. Okay, so there's whole sections where wisdom is teaching, and she's personified as a woman. I got a whole bunch of looks from wives.
Which of
And-
course we know is true.
yes, Paul, we know that it's true. There was like a whole bunch, like all of a sudden there were like elbows and sideways glances. Yes, of course, wisdom is personified as a woman. We all know this.
Are you asking, I can't always hear you, are you asking what different groups of people?
Yeah, what people
I was
are.
thinking of like an employer and the people that work for him and how they get along with each other.
Okay, so in some cases, an employer or a master is teaching someone. I should give you the answer?
Yeah, just.
Okay, so there are right and wrong answers, but I mean, so those are the people who are teaching. Now, who are they teaching? Who are these people? Who are parents teaching? Who is wisdom teaching? Who's receiving this education?
They're teaching their children.
Okay, so they're teaching children.
Anybody who's read it.
What's that?
Anybody who would read it.
Anybody who would read it. Anybody who would listen, right? Is that what you said?
Said the people of Israel.
Oh, the people of Israel, of course. Yep. Yeah, in Proverbs is it Proverbs 8? This is the chapter from Wisdom. And it says, does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights beside the way, at the crossroads, she takes her stand besides the gates in front of the town. At the entrance of the portals, she cries aloud, to you, O men, I call. See, that's even better. To you, O men, I call, and my cry is to the children of man. So wisdom is personified as a woman who is standing out, yelling to the crowds, saying, will anybody listen to me? Will anybody pay attention to my words? So we have that figure of speech there. So parents are teaching their children. Wisdom is teaching anybody who will listen. What is the content that's being taught? What information is being passed on from those who are teaching to those who would learn? Principles?
A lot of practical stuff for living. It's kind of the contrast of what happens when you're wise and what happens when you're a fool.
Okay, so there's
Consequences of those things.
okay, so there's consequences, right? If you do these actions, there's going to be negative consequences. If you do these actions, there's positive consequences. So that foolish versus wise living, that practical living. Worldview? No. Nice try. There. Yeah, no, not, yeah. Partial credit.
Are you keeping score here?
Yeah, I should have, it's teams, it's the left versus the right. The,
Women versus men.
well, that wouldn't be fair if we did women versus men. We just learned. In Proverbs 1, we'll just read the first few verses here of chapter 1. So the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Now, this first section of the book of Proverbs goes from chapter 1, verse 1 to the end of chapter 9. That's one unit of Solomon's Proverbs. Chapter 10, verse 1 starts the kind of the odd Proverbs of Solomon. In other words, the short little passages start from there. So 1 to 9 is a unit in the book of Proverbs. So the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, refers to chapters 1 through 9. And this is the introduction to chapters 1 through 9. So if we ask, what's the purpose of the book of Proverbs? What's it trying to accomplish? It tells us this in the first few verses. It says, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance, to understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. Now in my English Standard Version, you'll notice that, well, you can't see from back there. You have to take my word for it. But there is a space that's left between verse 6 and verse 6 and verse 7. Okay, so verses 2 through 6 they're saying is like a poetic stanza. Those all go together. And then verse 7. Verse 7 is, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now, you probably also have memorized that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but that's actually taken from chapter 9, verse 10, which, like I mentioned, concludes the first 9 chapters of Proverbs, which is a unit, the separate unit in the book. Okay, so the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And then verses 8 and 9, I'll add on here. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck. So we have some lists here, and in the Hebrew parallelism, I'll point this out a little bit, they go together. So one of the purposes is to know, it's for us to gain knowledge, but it's to know wisdom and instruction, and to understand words of insight. So in Hebrew, you have parallelism that helps us understand the different phrases. To know is parallel to understand. So knowledge and understanding, those are verbs in this case. These are things we're supposed to be able to do. And then what is it we're supposed to know? We're supposed to know wisdom and instruction, and we're supposed to understand words of insight. So wisdom, instruction, words of insight, they all go together. That's a group. In verse 3, we're supposed to be able to receive instruction, and primarily receive instruction in wise dealings. In other words, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like prudence when it comes to making a deal. Okay, this is the kind of the idea of wise dealings. Righteousness, justice, and equity actually don't have a verb, so it's probably to receive instruction in those areas as well. To give prudence to the simple, and knowledge and discretion to the youth. So now we have another category that's been given to us. The simple and the youth. These are people who are supposed to learn something. So who is someone who is simple? What's a simple-minded person?
Child, maybe.
Okay, a child might be simple. What does it mean to be simple?
Lacking intelligence in some way. I mean, people have different levels of abilities to think.
Okay, could be lacking intelligence. Daryl?
And it's untrained or without knowledge.
Okay, untrained, without knowledge. So you could be simple toward a certain thing, like Daryl could take me fishing, and my simplicity of knowledge about fishing would become apparent very quickly. Okay, because I really don't know anything about fishing. But in general, we think of simple, perhaps someone who who has a very minimal understanding, right? We could almost use the word immature, perhaps, of the simple. The youth, of course, age doesn't mean that you're naturally mature, unfortunately, these days, with especially young men in the world have proven that point. So you can, but youth, in their nature, haven't lived very long and are perhaps more gullible and have less discretion because they're unable to discern between things because of their youth. Verse 5, he says, "Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance." So from verse 5, the wise person is the person that we think of. They're the ones who can discern. They're the ones who do have understanding. They're like chapter 8. They've listened to Lady Wisdom. They've applied the teaching of their mother and father, and they are a wise child, Proverbs 10:1. But here it says that the wise person will continue to increase in learning. They will continue to listen, the word hear there. They will continue to listen to instruction. They're the kind of person who has a natural humility. They don't come in and think that they know everything. So the wise person and the one who understands are still those who can to benefit and learn. They don't come to the book of Proverbs and say, "Oh, I know all that. That's all good." Some of the other things that the book of Proverbs is trying to do in verse 6 is to be able to understand a proverb. And a saying, and the words of the wise and their riddles. So there is something about even riddles and things that are hard to understand. He wants to give us understanding in that. But now you'll notice in verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instruction. And that second part we understand pretty well. Right? So, and I don't say this because I have a daughter who's here today, but she could attest to this perhaps, that I commonly told both my daughters that if I'm trying to teach them something and they go, "I know," it's not allowed. Because if you knew, I wouldn't have to teach you. But since I'm in the position of having to teach you, you don't know. And if you come to me and say, "I know," then, not that Olivia would ever have that attitude, but then I can't teach you. There's nothing I can do. So we understand that attitude pretty easily when someone comes to us and is like, "Yeah, I know that." But what about the fear of the Lord? How do you teach the fear of the Lord? Or what is the fear of the Lord? What kind of thing is the fear of the Lord? Is it a piece of information? Like a fact? I can hand it out to you on a worksheet? Here's the fear of the Lord. Learn this.
Recognition of who God is, all his attributes.
Okay?
I mean, you only learn that from reading the Bible. You get that right.
Well, I would say it's respect for who God is.
Okay, so fear is, Joanne's saying, is a respect, okay, which is not the same as simply information. Although it's related to some information. Why should I respect this person? So I understand who they are. But fear isn't merely, it's not merely head knowledge that's being passed on, but it's something else. And that's actually what we're going to pick up next time. I didn't intend to totally answer that question today, but we're out of time, I can see. So you can read Proverbs again, and next time we meet, we'll talk about this conundrum the fear of the Lord, and how do we learn that, or how do we teach that, or how do we explain it? And I was going to talk more about fishing with Daryl next time, so you might want to hear that. Because there's a reason we've never been fishing. Daryl wouldn't take me fishing. Well, he might do it once. But we'll pick up on that. So when you look at Proverbs, some of the questions that we want to keep in mind is who's giving instruction to whom, who's learning, who's receiving the instruction, and what is it that they are receiving? The person who receives instruction, or the person who refuses to receive instruction. Who is that person? And we kind of look at these words that we have here, like wisdom, instruction, words of insight, wise dealing, justice, righteousness, equity. And then we have people like the simple, the youth, the wise, the one who has understanding. We try to put all those things together. So, any other last minute questions or comments? We didn't get very far, but maybe we'll come back again and we'll get further. All right. Well, let's close in a word of prayer. Carl, would you mind closing?
All right, Father, we're thankful that you give us wisdom and knowledge, and you want us to learn your words and obey your teachings. Give us joy when we obey it.
Amen. Thank you. All right, so dinner.